So, hi everybody, I think we're ready to start. Thanks for your patience. I think we've got all our panelists here and I'm really excited to share this topic with you. Before I introduce the panelists, so just some housekeeping things. Make sure not to trip over the cable over there. But if you're a student who's here for extra credit or signing in for signature, you can swipe your ID card at the laptop there. There's also a sign-in sheet if you want to be added to the Ethics Center's email list. We'd be glad to keep you abreast of all the fun things that we're doing. We do have one more event this semester on Friday. It's a talk by Justin Clark, who's a philosopher at Hamilton College, and he's talking about Plato's Dialogues of Definition. What is Socrates looking for? So if you're into Plato, you should come to that talk. I would note for you who do follow our events that the time has been changed from 5 p.m. to 3 p.m. on Friday. We do have flyers for that, so let me know if you need one, if there's not one by the computer. I'm Sandy Borden, the director of the Ethics Center, and we have history actually of working on the topic for tonight's panel, research ethics, and we're pleased to this time turn the focus on the high school setting. As you know, education in the STEM fields has long been a national priority because of the importance of these fields to innovation, global competitiveness, national security, public policy, and vital professions such as medicine. Even students who do not go on to be scientists or engineers benefit from learning the problem-solving and analytical thinking skills associated with STEM disciplines. But along with his attention to STEM has also come increasing attention from federal agencies to research ethics. And that refers to the moral considerations involved in funding, designing, conducting, and reporting scientific studies. These include such considerations as informed consent for human research subjects and conflicts of interest caused by partnerships between university scientists and private corporations. Indeed, there have been a number of scandals in science caused by ethical lapses. Nevertheless, science education in high school, where potential scientists are getting socialized into their profession, tend to focus on the technical aspects of scientific competence when teaching students about good science. For example, the next generation science standards for K through 12 education explicitly address technical competencies only. And so one of the questions for the panel tonight is, can science be good if it's not also ethical? So we've asked science educators from area STEM academies and medical schools to discuss the place of explicit research ethics instruction in high school science classes and the degree to which such instruction might foster ethical STEM cultures in high school and beyond. So, to introduce our panelists quickly, starting with our moderator, Dr. Susan Stapleton, who's the Dean of the Graduate College, and you may know her from other administrative capacities, such as most recently interim provost. We also have on our panel next, Carrie Ferrario, did I pronounce that correctly? Okay, assistant professor at the University of Michigan Medical School in Ann Arbor. Next we have Cheryl Dixon, Dr. Cheryl Dixon, who is, my little cheat sheet here, Associate Dean for the Health, Equity, and Community Affairs Department in the Office of the Dean at the Western Michigan University Homer Stryker MD School of Medicine. Next, we have Luke Perry, who is director of the Battle Creek Area Mathematics and Science Center, and Michael Tama, director of the Kalamazoo Area Mathematics and Science Center, known in these parts as CAMSI. FAMSI and CAMSI, both represented here. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sue and ask her to tell a little bit about herself in relation to the topic of this panel. The rest of the panelists will do likewise.
Thank you. So thank you all for coming this evening. I think it's an outstanding topic and one that I've been not only interested in but involved in terms of teaching research ethics for a number of years. For example, I've been a principal and investigator on a research experience for undergraduates program where we brought in students from universities all across the country to work with our science faculty for 10 weeks in the summer. And as part of that component, I would teach research ethics to those students. And we did that for 17 years. I've also, as graduate dean, introduced the requirement for our graduate students to take a research ethics course that is now required of all new graduate students, not only to have them start thinking about research ethics if they have not had that opportunity, but really to delve into how does that relate to good questions that can be asked, the approaches that they might be using, and conversations that they have with their faculty mentors. And so this has been something that I've been interested in for a number of years. Have co-written grants with the Ethics Center to try and receive more funding. But I think it's a great topic, and in particular a great topic to understand what's happening at the high school level, because as Sandy said, it's a time when really students are becoming sort of introduced to the profession. They're seeing what's out there in terms of mentorship and how to emulate what's happening in the field. And so I think it's a great topic for us to cover tonight.
My name is Carrie Ferrario, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. And my discipline and background is in psychology and in neuroscience. And my research area is really studying the brain and obesity and drug addiction. But in the context of our discussion today, I also teach responsible conduct of research is the official course title. It doesn't have the words ethics in it. That's partly because of my role as a PI in a training grant that supports the training of postdoctoral fellows, so people who already have their PhD degrees. And we talk about some of these same themes about needing to understand the rules and the guidelines that we've sort of agreed upon as a scientific community. And that's the area that I'm more comfortable with and familiar with, because that's sort of the training that I've gotten. But as I've been asked to teach about those things, I've sort of started thinking more and more about, well, where did these rules come from? And that started getting me to ask some questions, and I was fortunate to have a very knowledgeable neighbor, Janine DeLay, who is involved in this A2 ethics group, which is in Ann Arbor, and it's really interesting because it teaches ethics to high school students through a number of outreach programs, and I've gotten involved with those mostly as an observer, going, oh, isn't this interesting? Here's a framework for how to approach developing these guidelines. Here's a framework for how to talk about and think about these questions that we have in research. And so I'm really happy to be part of this group and this discussion today, because thinking about how we invigorate the STEM, people's interest in high school is really important and something that's near and dear to my heart, but also then how we give people tools to develop and evaluate what we think of as responsible conduct of research, particularly in this environment where we are moving so fast and so far ahead with what we can do in research, particularly in the biomedical research areas. I mean, great example of genetic editing. What we're going to be able to do has a lot of really important questions, and I think having a framework for understanding how we develop these rules and how we develop them across time is really important, and that's important from the high school level all on through education.
And hi, I'm Cheryl Dixon. I'm the Associate Dean for Health Equity and Community Affairs, and I'm actually a pediatrician by training. And what I do at the medical school is twofold. What I do is there's a course called Profession of Medicine that all medical students have to go through. It has three components. One is called Principles, where we look at things like ethics. There's a core component of ethics training for all of our medical students when they enter in. Second piece is clinical skills. Of course, ethics is incorporated into the clinical skills training for students. And the third is something called active citizenship, all part of the same longitudinal course, where students are placed in service learning and community organizations throughout Kalamazoo County, actually. And students are there for about 18 months. And in that part of the course, they actually develop projects. In our first year, those projects were social science research. And so it was really social science research of a project that actually benefited the community organization and the clients that they served in some way. My interest area is health disparities reduction, and also, of course, about creating health equity. The other thing that I do is I create programs and grants that I've written for the medical school for us to actually really partner effectively in the community to make a difference. And one of those programs that I created when I first came here is a pipeline program. That pipeline program is for high school students. It's more than one tier, but the tier that we've actually had the longest, this will be in the beginning of our fourth year, it's called Early Introduction to Health Careers. And it's focused on students from Kalamazoo Public School System that come from underrepresented ethnic minority groups, as well as that they and or maybe from low socioeconomic status, or that they are first generation to go to college. And the purpose of these pipeline programs are to introduce students to health career possibilities, and actually to promote diversity within health careers, not just becoming a doctor. So this is our 4th year, as I said. I'm very proud of the program. We have a capacity of 60 students. We recruit from all 3 high schools, and part of that program, it's actually a 4-tiered program. The students come with, the first part is that they have what we call a day in life, where we have a health provider professional talk about their career. There's a second part where it's giving them science instruction, STEM. They have them interested in science, but it's through a healthcare lens, and it's taught in the mini medical school format, which is team-based learning. The other component is research. So we actually have the high school students have a topic that they look into, do a literature research on. The medical students then help them with defining questions to ask about that topic. And then they, as a team, because we put the students in teams from all 3 schools, that are then mentored by the students as well as mentored by faculty, they create a end product at the end of our Saturday academies that are once a month for 9 months. And they present this in either in a poster format or a PowerPoint oral presentation format. We also have partnered with Kalamazoo College for a 2-week summer intensive, and 1 week they do biomedical bench lab research, where they learn research techniques for biomedical, focused in again on learning about how do you then translate something that will affect a person into a science that you actually do a research on. And they have been doing caffeine metabolism. So this is really very interesting. I was actually very glad to be invited to come to this panel because specifically incorporating in research ethics as a piece of what we're training the high school students, I can say that we're not currently doing that, except for some pieces, like the importance of looking at how you cite literature, for example, making sure you're not plagiarizing or making whole paragraphs. So I've really thought a lot about it, and I think that this is really intriguing and also something very important, I think, to be adding early on to that program of encouraging our future scientists and our future health career professionals. Thank you.
Wow, you're amazing. No, that isn't it. I am Luke Perry. I am the director of the Battle Creek Area Math and Science Center, and I have no idea what I'm doing on this talk right yet. I run a consortium-based half-day high school that serves 17 school districts in 3 counties. We are a competitive school, 1,800 kids. We'll test every year for my building for 117 freshman spots. Our school accelerates students through all of their math and science curriculum in 2 years, and so they'll do 4 years of work in 2 years, and then the final 2 years they will take extended courses that will allow them to specialize in fields that they're interested in. So if a student is math oriented, they could take differential equations. If they were chemistry oriented, they could take analytical chemistry. Biotechnology and bioethics is actually a course in our building. However, like you were saying, the structure of a high school doesn't really lend itself to having ethical conversations or conversations about how to develop ethical practices beyond don't cheat, don't copy people's works, do this, do that. And so this is a conversation that my staff and I have been having for quite a while about how we could actually incorporate ethics across the board. One of the things that we've done recently is we've actually incorporated research into every one of our courses now. And so in 9th grade, in their Algebra 2 course, they are looking at mathematical research and what that actually is and how it looks and how you play it out, all the way up to their senior year. One of the things that a BCMSC student will do is they will formulate an original research project, and they will present that project at our symposium every year, which is roughly about 150 different individual research projects presented every year. And during that process, they'll have to explain through what they did, how they went about it, and what problems they came across, what areas of concern, and then maybe how they would extend it. One of my hopes from being a part of this is to really figure out a way to involve students in a conversation about ethics so that it's meaningful in the individual research project each student creates. But that's fairly lofty. And Michigan State's standards that they expect students to learn don't really lend themselves to an ethics viewpoint. And so every time we have these conversations about these kind of esoteric topics at this level, we are always stuck with the end process that we as high schools serve what the state determines to be the important stuff. And so everything extra is stuff that we have to try and figure out how to add in. And so I'm hoping to hear that tonight. I'm hoping to have that conversation.
Good evening. My name is Michael Tama. I'm the director of CAMSI, the Kalamazoo Area Math and Science Center. We serve the 9 school districts of Kalamazoo County, and we are under the auspices of Kalamazoo Public Schools. My background is actually in chemical engineering and engineering and applied science. My research background, which I haven't been involved with for a number of years, was in computational combustion. That has nothing to do with tonight's topic. I mention that just to see how many people nod off when I mention that. So all of the students at CAMSI, which is roughly 300 students, are involved in a research agenda, most of them for all 4 years, some of them for 3 years. As 9th graders, all of our 9th graders do a biology-centered research project. Our sophomores do a chemistry-centered research project, and our juniors do a physics-centered research project. Some of our juniors will do an additional research project depending upon which classes they have. So, for example, in biochemistry, they may do a research project. And then some of our seniors, depending upon the courses they take, may do a research project. So that's sort of one half of our research agenda at CAMSI. The other half is what we call our research team. That's juniors and seniors may choose to pair up with a mentor in the community, perhaps at Western Michigan University or Kalamazoo College or one of the local businesses or one of the local hospitals, and actually engage in real-world research as part of a research team. And we'll usually have anywhere between 30 and 45 of our students doing that. Similar to what Luke mentioned at BookCAMSI, we have a symposium in the spring where all of our students prepare a research poster, and it's open to the public, and they have to explain what they've done. So we'll have upwards of 250 or so research posters on display. And then the Southwest Michigan Science and Engineering Fair, which is for the students who go out in the community and do that research. And Luke's school also has some students who participate in that. We actually meet here on the campus of Western Michigan over at the engineering school, and all those posters are on display and are judged by some of your faculty. So that's what we do as far as research is concerned. As far as ethics, again, the ethical conversations that we have at CAMSI are on the much more fundamental levels, one might say simple levels of plagiarism, collusion, cheating, things of that nature. All of our 9th graders spend about 2 days in one of their courses discussing what does that look like, what does collusion look like, what does plagiarism look like. But some of the deeper ethical questions that some of our panelists are involved with, that really doesn't hit us. On the rare occasions that our students are doing external research that involves, say, humans or vertebrate animals, they will have to sign off along with their research team, to make sure everything is proper there. But that's sort of the extent that we would get involved with ethics on that level. One thing that will make for an interesting discussion as far as bringing discussions of ethics into high schools is contrasting what you can do at sort of a STEM academy like Luke's school or CAMSI versus a comprehensive high school. So we may discuss some of that this evening.
Good, great. Well, thank you for all of that. And I think I had sent a few questions ahead of time so the panelists could think about this, and they've begun to talk about the fact that, I mean, quite frankly, even at STEM academies, there is not true explicit instruction in ethics or the conduct of research. It happens in sort of one-off conversations, it happens in group dynamics, and so really there's a void, I believe, that you've heard here about that ethical conversation, in particular with these individuals as they're maturing into their decisions about perhaps choosing science as a profession. Maybe we could talk a little bit about any sort of ethical consideration or ethical situation that you might have encountered in working with high school students. We've heard a little bit about some of the obvious things like plagiarism or manipulation of data that might be something that they might be faced with. But what sorts of ethical considerations have you found or faced when working with a high school student?
Well, I can mention one that actually just happened a couple of weeks ago. It was a case where two students handed in some work. It was in a biology class. Handed in some work that was identical. Some of the data, the presentation of the data, the chart, it was identical. So they were both charged with plagiarism. After a little bit of an investigation, it seemed as though one was guilty of plagiarism and one was possibly guilty of collusion. And after further investigation, it wound up that one was guilty of plagiarism, but the collusion charge was dropped against the other one. It's very difficult to investigate charges like that. You will ask the students to explain what happened, and depending upon how much time has passed since the event, different things can happen. So even these simple things, right? We can define plagiarism easily enough, and we can define collusion easily enough, but to investigate them can be very difficult.
Anyone else want to bring up a topic? I'll talk about one that I encountered in working with, and actually it was a high school student, and then the sort of same situation when working with students who are very new to the profession of research, and at least trying to accomplish that. And that has to do with who owns the information and the data. And because you come into a laboratory situation and there are other students who are carrying out work, and maybe you're shadowing or working side by side, but at the end of the day, who owns that information? Who owns that data? And that's a discussion that, quite frankly, I encourage even our faculty to have with graduate students, because if it's not clear who has their intellectual capital invested in it, what contributions are they making, then at the end of the day, you can have all sorts of missteps where somebody might take that information and present it where they shouldn't, or they report on it where they shouldn't, because it really, in the end of the day, isn't theirs to share in that way. And so I find that to be a very difficult subject that sometimes people avoid in conversation before they get to that point. But I know that it happens at the high school level, it happens at the undergraduate level, and we certainly see that even at the graduate level.
I was just going to add input to that. The other issue happens if that faculty or student leaves the organization, goes to another, and they want to publish or continue that research, and we get this question, can we do this? And so then we have to go back through, is there university policy? What's the ethical standpoint to determine, is there some written documentation, authorization to share that data that needs to be put in place? And it's actually something that we currently are looking at because we've had this question come up a couple of times recently, and there's no clear guidance.
Right, and I think that it happens for students who might come into Western, for example, to work in faculty laboratories, right? Who owns that information? Who owns that data? How do you allow somebody to go ahead and present on that in any sort of form or format?
And for some issues like that, there are well-written rules and guidelines. So, for example, I'm in a pharmacology department. A lot of people in the department partner with pharmaceutical companies, and there are written legal documents that say you cannot state the structure of compound X that you're studying. You may present data from compound X, but under no circumstances are you allowed to disclose what compound X really is, because it's proprietary and the company's working on it and they have a partnership, and so there's very clear understanding there. But then there's a whole range of other things where you develop an idea maybe together, right? You start off with somebody's idea, it develops over time, but the PI is working to get the funding to develop that idea further, and the students doing the work, and then it becomes very gray very quickly, and then they want to work on something related, right? And then well, how related is it? And you're asking somebody, is this your idea?
Right.
And what you're really asking them to do is make a very complicated judgment about what they think is right in this case, right? Is this is something that I consider my thought versus your thought, and what that means in terms of personal ownership. And that's a much bigger conversation than that gets to these kind of having these toolkits of understanding, so you can try to parse that and navigate it.
Yeah, and I think there's a movement toward a lot more group work, both from an in-class sort of assignment, but also, moving it toward research, involving lots of people to come together. And so that piece of ownership is a really tough question to ask and answer at any level, again.
So one of the things I thought of when you were asking the question was we collect data like nobody's business. We are the center is the king of data collection. Our students know how to collect data, they know how to organize it, they can evaluate it. That is something that's just kind of drilled into them from the first day until the day they graduate. I test roughly about 1,800 kids a year to get into the Battle Creek Area Math and Science Center, and so I have 5 years worth of data, thousands of data points of information simply on how well they did on this math test or how well they did at this aptitude test or things like that. One of the assessments that we use as a primary determining tool is called the OLSAT, and it's an aptitude test, but it sort of levels the playing field when you are testing students from such a huge demographic area. So I had students last year in the stats class who wanted to see if students from specific regions in Calhoun County were testing one way or another way on our very specific math assessment. And so at first I thought, well, sure, I have like 10,000 data points on this. Let's go for it. So I cleansed the data a little bit and let them go at it. Well, after a while, we began to have this other conversation about what do we do with it when we actually find out something? Who are we going to share this with? And what is the actual purpose of it? And what do we think they're going to do with this? And what are we saying about the people in this area by trying to apply this one specific data point to them? And it ended the research project because at that point we were way further into what even my students wanted to get into, which is this kind of ethical application of information. And so,
absolutely huge. I mean, with the amount of data that's being collected right now in outside of scientific settings, right? I mean, all of the data, right? Everything you purchase on your credit cards, it's in a database somewhere, and there's very different rules of conduct actually, from almost none, anything goes, to what we would consider in the research community responsible research on these data sets. And And I think for students, particularly even out in the broader scientific areas, going into companies and understanding that they should ask these questions. You know, should we be doing this? Do we have the permissions to do this, right? This is why Facebook has gotten itself into trouble, because there's no regulations which govern what they can and can't do, and they say because you signed off on something that they don't have to, right? And we would never, in a research community setting, we would never be able to just take human, subject data of any kind and do something that was not predefined with it. That's just something that, as a community, it's been agreed upon, that's self-policed by boards that regulate certain, that regulate how we use human data. It has to be anonymized, right? It can only be in certain people's hands. So at U of M, if I have a data set and I want to let her do some analysis on it, she cannot until she is formally placed onto my approved protocol. We can't just pass data around, but these rules don't apply in other settings, for example, private corporate settings.
May I ask a question? Excuse me, Fritz Zolhoff of philosophy. Luke, I was interested in yours. So if I want to do that here, I would have to go through, I have to go over to Julia and on the HSIRB. What do you all have to do? I mean, I'd have to think about FERPA, I'd have to think about IRB approval. There's a lot of stuff that I would have to do. Can you just run with the data, give it up, farm it up to students?
So I had to cleanse the data. I had to remove any identifiers on it and then randomize it. But once it was randomized, I had the master key to it all. But once it was randomized, the kids could do whatever they want with it. We did put data labels on areas, but because students you can't identify an individual, we were able to generalize from the data that way.
You don't have a program officer, you've got to go through, get cleared to do any of that stuff?
It's not, is it private or it's public?
It's public information.
Well, I'm the Associate Director for Research Compliance at Western. The IRB happens to be one of the things that I oversee. And Michigan actually has regulations that would apply, to you for human subject research. But based on what you were saying, if you're not disseminating that information out from the organization, it probably wouldn't meet the current federal definition of research, because you're not adding to generalizable knowledge and you're not transferring generalizable knowledge, where often in your case you want to publish something, and some of the rules that apply are WMU policies, where some organizations may choose to look at a particular category which the feds say is excused from exempt protocols. For instance, 45 CFR 46 doesn't apply to. At Western, we choose to treat exempt much like expedited. So the organization, it depends, one, how are you using the data? Is it being disseminated out? And what is the organization's policy on the different categories of review?
I think you said one thing that was really, really important that really kind of defines the difference between a high school and everywhere else. And that is that it's this idea of original research that's going to do something out beyond the organization itself. And that's not really what occurs in a high school. Mike and I are truly blessed with the students that we're allowed to be around. At least I feel that way. But because our students are really just outstanding young men and women who are doing amazing things out there. But just to be really bluntly honest, it's a lightning strike to have somebody who's making an impact outside of like the 12th grade class. It's high school. It's not generally truly original research.
I want to just take that a step farther, though, so there can be a nuance on there. So again, the type of data that Luke is talking about, and we have similar data, we can analyze it, and we might see something there that would allow us to give, say, a particular district some information. And so questions arise, number one, is it our business to do that to the district, to tell them, hey, perhaps you might want to consider changing something that you're doing? And just the question of letting that information be known. I mean, we would only let it be known to that district, but again, questions come up. Now, there is no board that we would go between. We have had this discussion among our teachers, so there are the questions always arise. And just to the point of whether or not I feel blessed to have the students I have, there's a parent of a current student and a graduate in this room, so I better say, yeah, I am blessed.
Thank you.
Well, to that, I might add, for the Battle Creek, when you introduced yourself, I was fortunate 3 years ago to have a Battle Creek student as an intern. She was interested in ethics. I worked with her. We had her for a semester. I actually had her look at our research misconduct policy, and we were blessed to have her. The only regret that I had is she had already chosen to go to MSU.
If you want another one, I have more.
So maybe speak a little bit to things like ethical codes or honor codes or protocols that you have at your institutions, and the type of conversation around that, and do the students then really understand what not only the implications of those codes are, but how that relates to much of the topics that we're talking about today?
So we present essentially our honor code to all of our 9th graders, and then any new students that we have who might join us as 10th or 11th graders or even seniors. We present that to them. We present it in a manner that seems fairly cut and dry, but it's clear that it's very difficult for a student without being put in the situation to actually understand what it means. So we talk about, protection of data, right? So if I'm writing a computer code and I'm going to leave my terminal for 10 minutes, I may not want to leave my computer code sitting on that terminal for anyone to see. And it's kind of difficult for students to get into that mindset of, I don't think I'm doing anything wrong here, but I don't realize that I might be tempting someone who may be struggling. So it's not as clear-cut on the receiver side as the presenter may think it is.
Cheryl, so I was going to say, of course, coming from where I come from in the medical background, we have lots of codes. So we have the academic code of honor that all students sign when they come in. It's also faculty do this pledge. And it's actually about a transition. So medical students that are coming from undergrad, it's about a transition of what you're now entering into. So you're now entering into this profession where there are these expectations. And those expectations are translated into professional code of ethics and moral and integrity and all those things that then carry forward for you now that you've signed on that you're a medical student. So like as soon as you open the door or come into the door, that's what we have, our pledges. And then the other is that we have the students, you probably heard of a white coat ceremony. And what we do is we have the students create their own oath. And it actually helps them to realize what it is that they value and what people value in taking care of them. And that oath is then recited at our white coat ceremony, and then it's that class oath. And that's something that they can continue to refer to, and it has things about upholding compassion, upholding who they'll take care of with honor, with integrity, all of those things that they aspire to do and commit to doing the minute that they enter the door. And we make that as something that you belong to us. You belong to this group of professionals, and it starts at that moment. We also have many, of course, each hospital, each clinic, there are all codes. There are ethical codes and things we have to sign off on. Insurance companies, all of the things that we are involved in as clinicians, there's always something that you're signing off as a code of professional standards that you're going to do. We had not, in this high school program that I have, the pipeline program, had anything that the students signed on about what we expected. So professional expectations or honor or what we expect for them when they're in this 9-month Saturday Academy and in our summer program. And of course we had an incident this past year that made us go, you know what, we really should have had that. And so we've now created, because again, what are we trying to inspire in these students? We're trying to inspire in them professionalism, leadership, teamwork, all those kinds of things that hopefully they'll embody and want to continue to go forward to be a biomedical scientist or a healthcare career professional. So now we've included that as something they sign in when they first come in, our new class that just came in, what we expect and what we want them to uphold to stay in the program.
So I think those are really good points. Like some personal ownership, especially making your own sort of oath and idea about this, to set up some rules, that are ground rules. But I think the other point that sort of brought up is putting them into practice, and putting them into practice in new situations. And I think a lot of that just comes with experience, right? Unfortunately, a lot of the rules and principles of conduct we have are because of mistakes that were made, or something came up that we didn't think about, and now we need to address it, right? And so I think that something really of value in trying to think of how we can incorporate ethics more broadly and more fundamentally is thinking about how we can instill the ability to evaluate those rules, the ability to think about, well, why do we think that this is the right action? Or I have a conundrum, right? I have a problem. How should I approach addressing it? Because there isn't a rule for this problem, right? There's always something where there isn't a rule for the problem. And if you don't have some idea of why it is you think the things you think, what that framework is, that ethical kind of compass, then I think it's really hard to deal with the problems. And something that kind of came across to me in teaching, so part of the responsible conduct of research, one of the pillars is talking about dual use, which is science that can be used for good or for evil, right? And you're charged as an individual scientist with determining whether or not there's a reasonable probability that the work you're doing, that you intend to publish, could be used for your presumably intended purpose, for good, to further our biomedical understanding, or if that could be used for an evil purpose, to harm other people. And you're charged individually with deciding this. You're charged as a scientist to bring it to a panel, which can then help you with how to proceed. But that means you're being asked to make that decision pretty early on. And I think oftentimes, in some of the kind of classic cases of this, those decisions weren't made until much later. So researchers said, hey, we wonder how come the avian flu spreads through the air, and the flus that affect there's other types of flus that flu doesn't affect humans, right? So it affects birds, it doesn't affect humans. So they started mutating the avian flu to see if they could get something that would spread through the air that could infect humans. And they were able to do it. And that was really useful as a scientific tool because you could understand how the virus mutates, and maybe then you could get ahead of it. But they didn't really realize that maybe mutating the avian flu to something that can spread to people might also be used for negative, evil purposes until they got to the publication stage. And an editor said, I'm not sure we should publish this in full and let everybody know that this is what the sequence is and how you can mutate this, avian flu to infect human airways. And there is a procedure that's in place to help evaluate that, and there were boards that were called in, and that was taken care of in a responsible way, but it was taken care of, very late in the process. It was entirely up to the scientists. And then when we develop new technologies, you might need to think about these things more broadly, right? And so if you don't have a framework for how to actually make these decisions, I think that it becomes more challenging. And so I really think in the high schools, like getting the students to think about why these are the rules, and maybe finding some muddier situations, right? To actually talk about a muddy situation where it's not really clear how you should apply these regulations and what you should do to try to figure out what to do would maybe be beneficial. I mean, of course, within the constructs, the framework of time available for the students, right?
Well, and that leads us to one last little piece that I'd like to get to, and then we'll open it up for Q&A with the audience, is about what are mechanisms to sort of bring this home to roost, if you will, in the high schools. This is somewhat of the good and the evil, and I think actually you talked a little bit about the data set that you were looking at and what could have been right and how that was stopped. But is it case studies? Is it a rigorous curriculum? Is it ensuring that everyone has an opportunity to do research? I mean, what are some of the ways that you think would be high schools in particular would be able to add this as a point of discussion, a piece of curriculum, in their already tight schedules?
Well, I'll say a couple of things about that. So first of all, on the one hand, the Michigan science standards that were adopted within the last few years they make it, to some extent, easier to bring this into the science classroom because the new standards are about practice and not about just content, okay? So on the one hand, that makes it a little easier to bring it into the science class. Now, on the other hand, if you just take your just a comprehensive high school, let's leave Battle Creek and Kalamazoo Area Math and Science Centers out of this. If you can't demonstrate that it's going to increase student performance in the sciences, then it's going to be very difficult to make the case to bring it into the science classroom. It may be a wonderful thing in another department, so let's not overlook that. I mean, it could be an elective in an ELA department or a part of a course in another department. But I think for just a general high school, in order to make it part of the science curriculum, it's either going to have to show that it increases student performance, which unfortunately is determined in ways that we might disagree with. I'll leave it at that. Or if there is some progressive Board of Education in a particular district that might say, we think this is a good idea, we want this to be part of our curriculum. At CAMSI, you know, we have a bit more variability on what we can do with some of our courses, and so again, we do talk about some ethical questions to all of our students, and perhaps that can be enhanced. But you know, we're two situations that are different from most of the high schools.
Yeah, I would. So I'm an English teacher before I became administrator. So I come from a thematic English. I taught middle school English for 10 years. But if you really want, and I wrote curriculum for school districts, and I presented in English curriculums all over the place. If you are going to make an impact on instruction in a normal school that's different from ours, then you have to show its comprehensive use, not its particular use, but its comprehensive use. And so the English classroom is the perfect place for an ethics discussion because it blends all of those features. It is a discussion about the written word, it is about conciseness and about meaning and about making meaning. It matches all of the literature and literacy standards that are out there, and it allows the science to actually be done in the science classroom. And on a much more fundamental level, it blends those two. So the English teacher understands that he should have been a science teacher because now that's where he works and he loves it. That's what we want to do. There are thousands of off-the-shelf curriculums that say they do this, that, and the other thing. And if that's the intent, then why bother? STEM is not about science, technology, engineering, or math. It is about the whole package and how they all work together. And so that's the way to do it. But like Mike said, you need a Board of Education who is just visionary, who can see how all of these facets work together and put that picture together for themselves.
But a lot of it does have to do with the quality of the science and being able to, you know, we say we conduct our science with integrity, you know, and high standards of, you know, that's sort of that's very vague, right? And so a lot of the principles and rules we have in place are to sort of guide that integrity, and so the quality of the outcomes is really, really shaped by adhering in some ways to some of these rules, and then asking ourselves how we should keep developing those rules. So I feel like it could sort of go in.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it does. I guess it's sort of not. It's sort of obvious to me as a scientist that understanding how to conduct, you know, research in an ethical fashion is directly related to the quality of the science. But maybe that's not intuitive. I don't know.
No, I agree totally.
Yeah,
what I think is
broader audiences.
Yeah, like for a high school student, if they don't know what integrity is, that's just a word.
Right.
And so you have to have a discussion with a high school student about what integrity is. And this is the thing about high school kids is you can't assume anything. Like they function, but they don't really function. And so you have to teach them every step of the matter. And that is actually a really fun walk to take with students, because they will apply that word in situations that you didn't think about. And then all of a sudden you're all thinking about something new. And so, like, I agree with you. Quality work is the difference between a smart kid and a kid who's struggling. And quality instruction is the difference between somebody who is struggling and somebody who is successful. But the conversations that occur in those classrooms, I think that Cheryl would agree, it's the conversation that occurs in that classroom and the passion of the people involved in it and the excitement of the content that creates the kind of kid we're looking for.
And actually application. So I think that what really works for us, what we do in the pipeline, is that it is actually how it's taught and how it's integrated in. So it's like it's an interactive where it's active learning, and it's actually then combined with a skill base. So I think the time to do it is, for example, in our programs when they are doing a research project and they are looking to come together as a team, that's actually the time when they're excited and motivated, there's something they've chosen, they've got people sitting there with them. That's the best time to actually integrate it in, because then they can actually then be excited about it and they want to do it. So. Yeah.
Well, and it goes beyond not only what they're doing locally, but then I think how that impacts globally. So just like the example you gave, and if you release the sequence and someone got a hold of it that shouldn't have, there's an issue. If we can create enough food masses by doing genetic engineering with plants, what does that do for the businesses that rely upon selling that, right? And
it's sort of asking who you're responsible to, right? And I think in medical practice, there's a lot of emphasis, right? Who are you responsible to, right? And asking those questions is really important. And so, is that something that you incorporate even in the high school level when you have this pipeline, talking about those ideas, or?
So right now we're not incorporating. So what we do though is, with the actual science through the healthcare lens, I will have them, we incorporate in health disparities. We incorporate in the meaning of, so when you're seeing this person who's got diabetes and understanding about metabolism and all that, what's happening? Yeah. What's happening also in your body is good questions. Well, why is it that there's a difference? And what kinds of, so looking that up and actually promoting curiosity is it. So we're promoting curiosity and drive. To say, okay, I want to know more about that, and that's self-motivated for them to then go forward to do more, and then we're there to kind of capture that.
Well, I wanted to make sure that we had time for our audience to ask questions.
I have a sort of a question comment. The Office of Research Integrity, which resides under the Department of Health and Human Services, is looking at mechanisms because research misconduct continues to rise. It is, to quote someone from that group, becoming almost epidemic. And we need to get a handle on it because it is threatening federal funding. When we fund projects that we find out later there's research misconduct involved, it undermines that. In addition, when individuals, so 10 years ago, you falsified your information and you published, and maybe 100 people use that as a foundation of their research. They publish 100 more, and it just continues to escalate. There's been different ideas tossed around. They've not come up with something definitive yet. That what they have discussed is at some point, and they haven't decided when, anyone that's headed down the road to research will be required to take a course and not just something online in research misconduct. There was discussion at the conference that I attended last year about should this be incorporated at the high school level to at least give them some baseline so that they understand the importance of integrity and not plagiarism and falsification and the impact that is having down the road. So it is a real issue, and we were tasked with thinking and maybe sending ideas to ORI to help them determine how are we going to address this. because it is a serious issue, and the internet, to some extent, somebody said, well, doesn't that help? It actually has exacerbated the problem. It's much easier to steal someone's information, and there are programs out there that, so I heard, that actually can help you manipulate that to where it's a little harder for those applications that you use to identify where things have been lifted. So it's an issue, and I appreciate some input.
So that's a really tough one, because you're talking about the minority of high school students who are eventually going to go into scientific research. And it's very difficult to target who those students are, when they're in high school.
But I think even if they never do scientific research outside of high school, I would love for them to understand the importance of that, because they may be somebody who can hold others accountable. Or
but if you mandate it, if it's mandated for all students, then you also have to decide what's going to come out.
Exactly.
Correct.
So that's what makes it complicated. And don't forget, we're struggling already just to have students learn science so that they can be an informed citizenry, right? That's sort of at the top of the list. We want students who, once they become adults, to be able to make informed decisions. So when there's a debate, I hate to use that word, on climate change, they're informed and they can make good decisions. That's sort of at the top of the list.
But that's hard to operationalize into a test or something, right, when you're in a high school setting. I mean, it sort of seems like everybody would want a high school student to be able to think for themselves and evaluate information and make logical, principled decisions. But that's hard to operationalize into a test to say this is some aptitude that you're now.
Sure,
so
but that's the way the science tests have moved.
Yeah.
So the students are going to be tested not really on recalling a bit of information, but on recalling, a science or engineering practice that they should have engaged in their classes, so that now when they're faced with it on a state test, they can do that.
Some of the principles of science, though, do lend themselves to at least having this conversation, right? So the idea of reproducibility, right? That's if you run an experiment once and you get an answer, that's step one. Principles of science, you have to replicate it, either you or somebody else, separately, before we will accept it as something, right? And hopefully multiple times. And so that sort of is a way to have a conversation, I think, about this idea of people faking data, right? Because, okay, if no one can replicate it, then that's a problem. And then that's the pillar on which you build going forward. Because what you're really asking, and I think, this is just sort of the way, it wasn't really explicitly taught to me, right? It was just, I would never harm science like that. I would never put out fake data because it could harm the fabric of what we as researchers are doing, which is trying to learn about the world around us, right? And so, to me, that would be like, that's just against everything I've ever been taught, but that's taking on a lot of personal responsibility, just like a doctor would never hurt their patient, right? That's just something that, you wouldn't deliberately cause your patient harm, right? But we're sort of getting away from that now with a lot of people who are conducting these, falsifying data, right? They're presumably thinking about just themselves and moving a lot of the impetus, which has been being discussed, and I don't know how much data there is behind this idea, but the idea is that, well, it's just so darned competitive now. It's pushing people to their breaking point, and it's making people who are otherwise reasonable fake data. I'm not sure I believe that argument, but that's really a moral, they're either a good person or a bad person sort of framework, right? But so I think that you could sort of put some of these things in there, and you could sort of try to teach them by just teaching what the pillars of science are, right? That we have to build on this knowledge and maybe instantiate that. I don't know if that's...
I agree, and again, that's easier to do under the current standards than under previous standards. So the door is
because that's
certainly
an
open for
aptitude,
that.
right?
Yep.
You have to understand that you
It's
cannot fake data, no
It's
matter how much you
practice,
want to fake data for your own personal gain. There's this bigger picture there.
Are there, so just on the sort of curricular space argument that it's hard to do ethics because the day is so full, are there other workarounds we could think of in terms of like extracurricular activities? So for example, we have high school ethics bowl that Janine organizes and Mitch teaches. Is there, can we do like an ethics reading group? Are there other things after school we could just try to find students who wanted to hop in on, or
Somehow STEM focused.
Sure. So either before school or after school, you could actually have a class that, might be a pass-fail class, a reading class.
Okay.
Right, so we have a couple of reading classes at CAMSI, evolution of scientific thought, things of that nature.
Cool.
So that's something that could be done. It could be looked at as a club or a credit, no credit course.
And those, I guess would just depend, but are they generally well subscribed, or are there just too many options for students to care?
So the drawback of the course we offer is that it's at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday, but we'll still get 15, 16, 17 students, sophomores. It's
That's
only
good
open
for 7 a.m.
only open to our sophomores
They didn't go to bed that
to
night
do it.
before.
Interestingly, that idea kind of gets to the heart of it's starting to target the students who might actually have an interest in the scientific area. So that could.
Ironically, those might not be the students.
You're a genius.
Well, we might not care. Those might be the students we want to capture, though, right?
Yeah.
It could be
Right,
those
exactly.
that don't care about ethics that we want to get.
Yeah.
So there's self-selection problem, but yeah, thanks for that.
Sure.
But I also like the idea that, ethics in science isn't just for scientists. And how do you broaden that and bring that discussion into the English classes or the political science classes or the psychology classes, so that
It's all over, because psychology has a riddled
Right.
past with human ethical violations in research.
yes, they do. But so that it's not just the scientist who needs to be thinking about this, but it is incumbent on us as a society to really have these discussions. You can look at the toxicological aspects of, for example, the Flint water crisis, but there are more ramifications to that than just the science.
And I came from Maryland Hospital. I oversaw the Office of Human Resource Protection there. And we had a course, or we called it a competency for all 3,000 hospital employees in particular areas. And it was more about integrity, professional development, and being a good community member versus research. There are components of research ethics that can be applied in a lot of areas. And I think that for ORI or actually Health and Human Services, and there was someone from education there, and they discussed how they may broaden that so that you're not specifically talking about science and research, but you can take those components and break them out so that you can at least lay that foundation, about honesty and integrity in everything that you do, not just because you're headed down a particular path.
So my background is in education also. I taught for 18 years in a normal school.
I know you. I feel like I had you as a teacher or something.
Yeah, I've been teaching for 12 years in the Western UP. Your counterpart, Joe Chatty.
Oh yeah, yep,
Okay.
all right.
And I know in my district and in several other districts, because I know my district did not invent this idea, they've been pushing the idea of positive behavior intervention systems.
Supports, yeah.
And they usually have an ethical component to it. So I know in the Houghton district that they specified integrity and respect as two of their keywords. And this goes back to the fact that we do need it in the sciences, and I taught science, but we need it overall also in just our society. And I think that's one way that you can actually hit everybody with at least part of it. And it was taught, it was actually mandated to be taught in each classroom, one aspect of it on a weekly basis for just like 15 minutes by our district. It was a district decision.
So in my school, we have 5 core values that everything kind of hinges on. I don't have an honor code. We don't have a code of conduct, we have 5 core values. They are excellence, integrity, respect, innovation, and compassion. Those 5 core values guide everything that we do.
Right.
Everything comes back to them. We talk about them twice a week as a student body. We have twice weekly whole school assemblies where we all get together for, it's really 5 minutes long. Right. And we talk about what's going on. If there's a question or a rule that needs to be set up, I send it back to them with those 5 guidelines. That's the foundation of what we do. And then we teach all the subjects. Right. And so like earlier today, tonight, it's about a foundation or it's about integration. And so we've fundamentally structured our school around those 5 core values. And like if you ask my kids, they know it.
Right, ours too. Ours were the acronym GRIP, right? So it was goals, respect, integrity, and teamwork. And everything in the school, for middle and high school, revolved around that. And as a science teacher, I taught, because I shoved it in wherever I could, ethics in the classroom, both for research, because we did active research programs, but it wasn't part of the overall curriculum. It was a choice I made as a teacher, and I had the flexibility to do that, which is one way to get around the whole curriculum issue.
So, yeah.
I have a question, and I'm drawing on what you're suggesting. How about schools of education integrating philosophy and ethics in actual in the teaching core itself, so that what's being done there? I'm not so much thinking of imposing professional development, but what's happening with respect to teachers learning about philosophy and ethics in schools of education.
Teacher training in those areas.
I have no idea.
There are components in terms of teacher preparation that deal with that, but I think the curriculum is, I don't think it's a set curriculum. I think it ends up being the instructor who's in the classroom as to the level and the amount of attention that they pay toward that, but it is part of the standards that are used in terms of teacher preparation.
Because it just seems to me that one of the issues is that it's fine to have principles, but without a discussion and without having teachers understand how to engage in a good discussion, that is just going to be falling on deaf ears. I mean, I taught ethics for 24 years at the high school level. The whole idea of starting with conflicts of interest or plagiarism would never occur to me. I would think of larger consequences. This dual use issue would be extremely exciting to discuss. This data, when you went into the data, totally fascinating. I can't imagine starting with plagiarism.
See, I think it's really important to remember what a high school is now and what it was when we were all in high school, because there is no wiggle room in the state right now. There is no high school ethics class because there's no time for a high school ethics class. And that's a lot to do because everything's bound by the assessments that we have no place and no decision in, that is mandated upon schools, and then they are then responsible for getting the grades on. Where Mike and I, where we just get some real leeway is that I don't know about you, but I'm not bound to any test scores. Those all go through their home schools, and because I accelerate so fast, that I get 2 extra years of 12 different classes where I can take kids wherever we feel like going because we're already past high school level content.
Yeah, frankly, our students will do fine on the state assessments, and so it's not a concern. You know, the point you raised is a great one, but the place to start for something like that, to have our teacher departments, our educational departments, to bring something like that in, the place to start, I think, is to go to the teacher evaluation protocols and have you know, some sort of ethics component enter those, because again, it's unfortunate, but that's what is emphasized in schools. Teachers know that they're going to get evaluated against certain guidelines, and if something isn't in those guidelines, both the administrator and the teacher aren't really going to take time to bring that into their classroom. So a place to start is to talk to, is to start with the experts in teacher evaluation, the people who do research there, and make that suggestion. And then from there it can trickle into the education of teachers.
Yeah, it's like that for good and for evil. There's a whole lot of for evil in teacher eval. And there needs to be some teacher good. Ethics would be really great in teacher eval.
So that would be a good place to start. Call Charlotte Danielson up and
please
tell her to get on it.
We have a question here.
No, I was just commenting. I think that it would be a good idea to have some sort of like ethical standards in high schools, because I don't know if it differs by state, but like I'm from Indiana and we didn't really talk about ethics or anything at all. So college is kind of like the first time I started hearing about like ethical research and what that even meant, So only thing we really hear about in high school is like plagiarism. Don't plagiarize, you get M, and that's it. And that's all they like touch. That's all they go on, and that's it. But they don't really go into what that looked like, And then the fact that people that do it, most of the time it's like not on purpose. They don't even know that they're doing it, So I really didn't learn too much on that until I got here, and I think it'd be beneficial for people younger to get the understanding before they get here, because it's a lot more critical than punishment once you get to college.
Thank you.
No, that's very valuable.
I wanted to tell you about a research project I did as an undergraduate, finishing a degree in psychology, University of California, Santa Cruz, before coming to Michigan to study medicine. I wanted to look at minus polling doses of vitamin C withdrawal and cold symptoms. And all I had to do was to write up my project and get the director of the Student Health Center to approve it, and then I could go ahead. And one of my subjects wanted to pick a phone with me. Jim, I opened up one of your capsules because I want to taste the vitamin C. It wasn't vitamin C, it was sugar. And that destroys your aura. So I tried to explain, but I'd already assaulted her, and I think her understanding why you need placebos that didn't go very far. And that's it. Well, I can tell you what I found was that maybe 5-6 days after stopping, 2-3 grams of, if I told her, don't open the capsules, you're not going to taste vitamin C, it's sodium ascorbate, it's not going to taste like vitamin C. They would get cold symptoms. So the Linus Pauling doses would suppress cold symptoms and would stop them, and they would show up. Now, if I had to tell them ahead of time that placebos were going to be used, and what I chose to use for placebos, I would have gotten nowhere. So, fortunately, I didn't have to do that.
Can I go back to the comment that your student made in the back? Sure. I was still thinking about what you said, but so in the freshman orientation at college, do they cover any of these ideas about research ethics or just any of the sort of concepts?
In my experience, freshman orientation was just like, here's your Bronco ID, make sure you carry it everywhere, this is somewhere the classes are.
I mean, you're right.
It's like your leader, make sure to talk to her, give her your phone number, and then we didn't really talk about.
I mean, I know we're supposed to be thinking about the high school level, but what I'm hearing is that, it's very challenging at the high school level. The STEM area is a good, potential place to start and to get these sorts of conversations going and sort of training going. But if it's not happening at the high school level, then something really basic, even as people enter school, could be very useful.
Well, it's many institutions, and we're one that has gone to this, what they would call matriculation ceremony. And there is in essence, a code that the students recite in terms of being ethical and with integrity. But I don't think there's any discussion around that.
You just get, you
You come to a
words,
large
yeah.
auditorium and you recite this, but it's a perfect, I think, opportunity to take that back to some of the things that we do during those welcome weeks about what does that mean? You've stated this. What are the expectations of you as a student now that you have made this pledge?
Having gone through the freshman orientation last year, we did touch on, as Western students, we are expected to conduct ourselves with an honor, but there was no context provided. There was no, here's why you say this when you become a student. And I can tell you that with everything that goes on within Welcome Week, just repeating that is not going to sink in with anybody.
You look at the amount of students that we are getting that have community college credit, middle college, and now we have accelerated degree programs where students can start doing graduate work during their undergraduate years. It would seem to me that that ethics piece ought to be ingrained at the high school level. And I think you mentioned earlier that because of the state has a mandate in terms of what teachers have to do in a regular school, but it would seem to me that where could you take this? Where could teachers possibly get the freedom to do this? Because to me, we're not helping the student if we don't introduce that early. Because now we're asking them to get these, we're pushing them because they've accelerated already before they get to us. And to not introduce the ethics piece earlier, to me, it's not good because they're just moving fast.
Yeah, I would agree, and there's no solution. Again, this is a real fundamental issue. I mean, you could probably ask, all the teachers in the county, and 85% of them would tell you that it's problematic that non-educators are making up the rules.
If we made a question on our
And I don't mean to use that as a cop-out, but
application.
I mean, I certainly could not disagree with what you're saying, and the question is, how do you do it when you're constrained?
We have one in the back.
I feel like if I was like a teacher in high school, I would probably, I know in Indiana there was like this state code and it was like very strict, but the way in which you taught was kind of up to you as long as you taught the material. So I think I would just introduce like, okay, here's the assignment, and just say, like, talk about ethics and stuff like 5 minutes. And then every time you get something, just ingrain it a little bit, like 5 minutes a day or something like that. So you don't have to spend a whole class on it or anything like that, but just like make sure that they know what it is and understand it, so that like eventually it'll probably get annoying, but they'll know, like, they'll understand what it means,
That
But
sort of goes back to
I don't think it's something that needs to be like a whole class or an hour or something like that. Just like put it in like whenever you could, it'll be fine.
It goes back to sort of what Janine was talking about with just getting the teachers sort of comfortable with it, but also, I mean, it seems like, so I'm unfamiliar with high schools currently because it's been a little while since I've been in high school, but it seems like having 5 guiding principles or core values or something is very prominent. Michigan has guiding core values as well, right? And so, I mean, it seems like if you're doing 5 minutes of that once in a while, it could be natural to sort of be mindful of trying to bring in these concepts as they relate to science and encouraging your teachers to talk about them. I mean, is that, because it wouldn't be curriculum, is that a good starting point, or do you feel that's going to fizzle too fast?
So, I don't, I think I've sounded like a downer most of the evening, and that's not my intent.
No, I'm glad you're telling us what's happening.
It's just, we have to figure out how, and the easiest way to facilitate change is to officially make it important to do that. And to say give up 5 minutes, three classes a week to talk about this, it doesn't sound like much. But I know certainly the teachers at my school, and I'm going to assume a lot of teachers,
they're struggling.
Giving up 2 minutes is something,
and it probably has to be something that the teachers also really, for lack of a better term, buy into. Right, they have to really value it, right? You have to see and
They
then
either
some,
have, right,
that's
so there
evaluate.
could, right, if you have a group of teachers who collectively feel that this is important, they'll find a way to put it in. But again, the way to have it more universal is for it to come down from the state or through the teacher evaluation methods.
Positive behavior intervention support, so you're talking about, that's a state mandate, we all have to do that. And so that's how you spread that out there. It's a great program, it's waffly on how it's used, but it came down from on high. And lots of schools were already doing those things, and all it did was kind of cement them as really good processes. But like we do a lot of really good things, but because we have time and because we can actually do those things. But when you have a school that's segmented and they are being given a whole different set of criteria that they have to assess to, every minute is important, and they're measured minute by minute. They're not measured over blocks of time. It's minute by minute. I've been in schools where if the principal walks in and the students aren't doing something at the bell and all the way till when the bell rings, then they're in trouble. And so these things, it's good to know what education in Michigan is right now, because when you actually know what the picture looks like, then you can work to create real change. Otherwise, it's just a Band-Aid, and we're just talking about topic.
Well, and I think that it's why the Department of Education and Health and Human Services didn't see an easy fix for that very reason. It's like, look, they have X, and we want to hold them to task to that. How do we integrate this? And they haven't come up with an answer yet. What at Western, what OVPR has done, or I've done, is I've reached out to incoming students in specific areas, and I make myself available to any instructor that wants me to come and talk. But in the last couple of years, we've had issues with undergrads who are excited about research and want to get started, and so they do, and then they find out there's a compliance concern. So we've reached out to, like, the Honors College in particular, to help maybe just give a brief compliance presentation so that the students know where to reach out to, before they implement something and they haven't covered the required training, and for most of it's human subjects, so they haven't come through the IRB like they're supposed to. But that's a small group considering the number of undergrads that are here.
Coming from a fairly large traditional school just north of Kalamazoo, and my classroom experience is rather varied. I teach an AP environmental course, a regular AP environmental course, and then another course called project-based science, where that ethical issue I've been dealing with for 18 years, when you have students that come in and say they want to do a velocity study on projectiles, and they're talking about bullets, or students that want to have a microbrewery at home because they want to check yeast fermentation rates.
There you go.
I like that.
Yeah, and you're like, okay, so this one can't come to school, but who's going to sign off on this at home? I have wrestled with a number of the topics we're talking about. I could go on for days about these issues, but to speak to the bigger issue that teachers have to deal with is that I teach elective courses. So I have a lot more leeway to talk and segue into philosophical questions than my colleagues who teach core courses like Algebra 2 and Chemistry, where they're being measured on a yearly basis. And then when you get into evaluations, and I clearly understand your pain there because it's so subjective there when you have evaluators who don't have science backgrounds, which is the biggest complaint in my building, when you've got people who don't know science questioning how and why you're doing something, even if they have a standard next to them, and thinking that maybe now that they're science teachers and they have to explain themselves. I can tell you this much, and going into my 23rd year of teaching, it's all been science, that the complexity of what we're wrestling with from what the young lady said here is easy for me to address in my classroom because environmental science is loaded. Every day I come in and talk to my kids, and we can talk about philosophy and ethical issues till the cows come home. I've told kids I could teach an environmental ethics course for the whole year and not even get into the core pieces, but I've still got to prep my kids for a test in the spring. But even my regular kids get a dose of where are we going with this? Are we making good decisions as a society? But my colleague who teaches chemistry doesn't have that leeway. He's got to make a certain mark by the end of the year, by the end of the marking period, and their scores, and when scores don't come in our district the way they need to, their feet are held to the fire. I can sit back and have a little bit more comfort trying to support them. But I think the bigger issue that we're looking at is that those of us who have leeway will. Those of us who don't probably won't. And that's just a reality factor because they're under a different set of pressures. And we've addressed this in a building in my district that even within our department said, elected folks, we have more leeway than our core colleagues have to teach to. And they'd love to touch on these. And I guarantee you, if you have my department in here, and we've got about 30 people in my department, those who are in the court say, great idea, I don't have time. But the forensic science teacher who teaches with me touches on that every day when she's doing case studies and examining case pieces. So I came down tonight because I wanted to hear this because there were so many things and being a Western alum and all of these questions. But from a teacher standpoint, I don't know how many folks are going to get a chance. The two gentlemen up on the panel, I think have hit it on the nose. There are some folks who are going to have the time and others just don't have it. They're under so much pressure to make sure that test scores come in right. They're in those core areas where the state is just coming down so heavily. And NGSS in our district is going down like a lead weight.
NGSS?
The new standards that they rolled out. And we've got some people that are championing it, but I'll be honest with you, they're struggling in the classroom with their kids. The kids are absolutely digging their heels in and they're not finding it enjoyable. And so that fight is going on in amongst everything else we have to deal with. So I love this idea of the ethics piece, but I think for some people it's just a day-to-day struggle just to get through their material. And those of us who have the leeway and time will take the time.
So here's an interesting spin-off question. So if next year it turned out that your principal asked you to teach biology and asked your forensic science colleague to teach chemistry, with your background, would you just naturally add some of these ethical pieces to your chemistry course?
Yeah, absolutely. Biology asks that.
So,
but
right. So so it can be done, right? It can be done, but there's a mindset that has to develop over a long time to realize it can be done, and the structures that are in place don't lend themselves to that mindset.
No, absolutely. And I can give you a case in point. We had to do some scheduling changes, and literally one of my colleagues, my teaching partners, I call him teachers AP Bio with me, and his room was connected, and he and I are supposedly two of the most popular science people in the building, got asked to teach an overload. But yet they did not try to give him that overload, but not another teacher wanted to take his one section of AP Bio. Why? Because they didn't want to be the teacher teaching that group of kids that didn't have the superstar.
Yeah.
I mean, to the point that this teacher was like, you find another way because I'm not going to be that teacher the kids hate walking in there. Another point, the department chair said, okay, the only way out of this is then for me to teach a class he has never taught, i.e. the forensic science class. Uncomfortable with it, but he's like, this is the only way we're going to make this work and keep civil war from breaking out within the department. So staffing issues become huge. And we're looking at some staffing issues right now because we're talking about introducing a course where we're going, we don't have the people to do this. If you take the people out of our main building and put them in our freshman campus, we don't even know where we're going to get these folks to fill that void.
But the other thing I think that becomes a critical piece is the students can pick up on this, right? So if there's a topic or there's an enthusiasm being taught in one area and not in another, is it just because it's the whim of that teacher? Or is this really something society is asking us to be aware of and to really put on our radar? And so the integration across curriculum, I think, is really, really critical and important to set the tone and to set the stage. But you're right, you come down to these other factors that come into play.
How are electives determined? Like, because I'm so unfamiliar with, so every high school student has to have so many electives, and that's uniform across Michigan, and then how the types of electives offered are just really at the whim of each high school district? Or?
Every student has to have a certain amount of credit, or a certain amount of courses, and a certain specific courses. The electives are filled in based on the whims of the district, really. And the districts actually determine the amount of credits that a student needs to graduate with. And so courses are filled in from that. But like I mean, in our area, so in the 4 close districts that are to us, I don't know of an AP Environmental Bio class in my 4 school districts around. So like that's an amazing opportunity.
And the flip side of that is, north of you guys, there's probably 5 of us.
Yeah. So
like in different
it's
districts,
just like you get in
5 different districts teaching AP.
So you get like an interest somehow, right? Somebody must have had it somewhere. Somebody had an interest. They started it and it grew, and now that's an interest in this region, and it's not an interest in because there is some flexibility. I mean, this makes me feel a little hopeful because you're right. It's been a little gloomy with the constraints, and it's not your fault. It's other people's fault. People we vote for, I guess. But so it's sort of nice that there is some. So maybe that's a point of flexibility is in the elective pieces, and maybe sometimes electives could be integrated with some of the core classes and curriculum to bridge it.
The problem with that is that you don't hit everybody with these elective classes.
Correct.
True.
So
right now we're hitting nobody. So
right. Except for these teachers that are hitting a few people, or like I taught core classes. I taught
so then you're going to
required
get
classes, biology, and in my school physical science, taught chemistry, and you're hitting everybody. I taught in a small school, so I was hitting everyone. I got every single kid that ran through that school. And if you can feed it into classes like that, even if it's like 5 minutes at a time, you're at least hitting everyone. You're not doing anything in depth.
Right. Yeah, but at least they're aware of it. It's there.
So I'll give you something positive, you know. And I have mentioned this to teachers to talk about new things with the next generation science standards because it seems difficult, which is basically okay. The state assessments are telling you that 15% of your students are at the proper level. So what do you have to lose by introducing 5 minutes of ethics a few times a week, right? What do you have to lose? So then I'm going to leave you with that positive note.
Your aptitudes.
Well, I think we need to thank our panel, and I'm sure they'll be here for a few minutes yet if you have individual questions that you'd like to ask. But let's and thank you all for the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.